You know someone like this. They're at the dinner, the concert, the birthday party. They're present, laughing, engaged. But when you check social media later, it's like they were never there. No posts, no stories, no carefully curated evidence of their existence. And here's what's strange. They seem lighter somehow, less anxious, more content, like they're living in a different psychological space than the rest of us. But it's not about being antisocial or technophobic. It's something deeper. Because the decision to not post, to experience life without documenting it, to exist without broadcasting it, creates a fundamentally different relationship with reality itself and the psychology behind it. It's fascinating. Modern neuroscience is discovering that the simple act of sharing our experiences actually changes how we experience them. That the camera between you and the moment isn't just capturing life, it's altering it. Today we're exploring 5 psychological secrets of people who never post photos, not to judge those who do, but to understand what happens to the mind when it stops performing, and why that silence might be the most radical act of self-preservation in the digital age. Let's establish something first. This isn't about moral superiority. People who don't post aren't automatically more enlightened, and people who do aren't shallow. But there is a psychological difference. And it's worth understanding, because in the span of just 15 years, humanity has conducted a massive, unplanned experiment on the human psyche. We've taken an ancient need, connection, recognition, belonging, and digitized it. We've turned private moments into public performances. We've made validation quantifiable. We've created a world where experience and documentation have become almost inseparable. And most of us adapted without questioning it. We started posting, sharing, curating our lives for an invisible audience. It became normal. But some people never joined in, not out of judgment or fear, but because something in them resisted. And psychologists are now discovering that this resistance might be protecting something essential. Here's what research shows. The act of capturing and sharing experiences activates different neural pathways than simply living them. When you're thinking about how something will look on social media, you're engaging your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for planning, judgment, and social evaluation. When you're fully immersed in an experience without documenting it, you're engaging your limbic system, the emotional core that processes genuine feeling and memory. These are fundamentally different modes of being, and people who don't post have, often unknowingly, preserved something rare, unmediated experience. The ability to be somewhere without thinking about how it appears, to feel something without immediately translating it into content, to exist without the constant background hum of self-surveillance. This creates a different internal landscape, and that difference shows up in measurable ways, in happiness, in anxiety levels, in sense of authenticity. Let's explore why. Think about the last truly beautiful moment you experienced. Maybe it was a sunset, a conversation, a quiet morning with coffee. Now ask yourself, what was your first impulse? For many of us, it's automatic now. Reach for the phone, frame the shot, adjust the lighting, take multiple versions, choose the best one. Write a caption, post it. And here's what's quietly tragic about that sequence. By the time you're done, the moment is over. The sunset has passed while you were adjusting filters. The conversation has moved on while you were thinking of captions. You documented the experience, but did you actually have it? Now imagine a different approach. You're at that same sunset. You feel the warmth on your skin. You notice the exact shade of orange bleeding into purple. You breathe it in. And then, nothing. No phone. No photo. No post. Just you and the sky and the feeling. It's uncomfortable at first, isn't it? Because there's this strange anxiety that emerges. If I don't capture this, did it really happen? If I don't share it, does it matter? If nobody sees it, was it real? These questions reveal something profound about what social media has done to our sense of reality. We've outsourced our memory to the cloud. We've outsourced our validation to likes. We've outsourced our sense of whether something matters to the audience's response. And slowly, without noticing, we've started experiencing life as content creators instead of as human beings. People who don't post have escaped this loop. not because they're better at resisting temptation, but because they never entered the contract in the first place. They kept something private that was meant to be private, their actual life. Their joys aren't performed, their sorrows aren't curated, their existence isn't a narrative constructed for consumption. When they're happy, they're just happy, not happy with an audience. When they're struggling, they process it internally or with close friends, not by broadcasting a carefully composed version of vulnerability. When something beautiful happens, they experience it fully, because there's no part of their brain simultaneously narrating it, framing it, preparing it for external judgment. This creates a very particular kind of freedom. The freedom to be inconsistent, to be boring, to have experiences that don't translate well to a screen, to exist in all your unmemorable, unimpressive, perfectly ordinary humanity, without witness, without record, without proof, just living. And there's a psychological richness to that kind of existence that's becoming increasingly rare. Let's examine what's actually happening psychologically. First, the paradox of authentic self-concept. Psychologists distinguish between your actual self and your ideal self, who you are versus who you wish to be. Social media collapses this distinction because every post is a choice: what to show, what to hide, which version of yourself to present. Over time, you start performing your ideal self so consistently that you lose touch with your actual self. Research calls this identity fragmentation, when the presented version of you becomes more familiar than the real one. People who don't post sidestep this entirely. They're not constantly editing themselves for public consumption. They're not maintaining a brand. They're not managing an image. This allows for what psychologists call integrated self-concept, when your internal sense of self matches your lived reality. An integrated self-concept is strongly correlated with psychological well-being. You know who you are because you're not spending energy being someone else. Second, the hedonic adaptation problem. Here's a cruel truth. Experiences shared on social media provide two hits of pleasure. The first is the experience itself. The second is the social validation when you share it. Sounds like double the happiness, right? But neuroscience reveals the opposite. When you anticipate sharing an experience, your brain starts seeking external validation instead of internal satisfaction. The experience becomes instrumental, a means to get likes, rather than intrinsically valuable. Studies show that people who photograph experiences with the intent to reshare report lower enjoyment than people who experience them without documentation. It's called experience interference. The very act of preparing to share diminishes your capacity to savor. People who don't post avoid this interference completely. Their pleasure isn't contaminated by validation seeking. Their memories aren't coloured by how many likes they received. They experience things for the intrinsic reward of experiencing them. This preserves what psychologists call autonomous motivation, doing things because they genuinely matter to you, not because of external rewards. And autonomous motivation is one of the strongest predictors of lasting happiness. Third, social comparison and mental bandwidth. Every time you open social media, you're exposed to hundreds of curated highlight reels. Your brain processes each one as social comparison data. Even if you consciously know it's not real, your limbic system doesn't care. It still generates comparison anxiety. Research shows that just 30 minutes of social media use increases feelings of inadequacy, envy, and dissatisfaction. People who don't post often don't scroll either. They've opted out of the comparison machine entirely. This frees up enormous mental bandwidth, cognitive resources that would otherwise be spent evaluating yourself against others. And that bandwidth gets redirected toward presence, creativity, and genuine connection. These aren't small effects. They're fundamental differences in how consciousness operates. Now contrast this with what's become normal. We live in a world where people photograph their food before eating it, where vacations are measured by Instagram worthiness, where grief is announced, joy is broadcasted, suffering is shared, not for support but for engagement. We've turned human experience into content, and content requires an audience. So we've all become performers in a play that never ends, constantly aware of how we're being perceived, constantly curating, constantly performing. And here's what nobody talks about. This is exhausting. Not just emotionally exhausting, neurologically exhausting. Your brain wasn't designed to maintain a public persona 24 hours a day. 1. It wasn't designed to evaluate every experience through the lens of, is this shareable? This constant self-monitoring is what psychologists call chronic self-consciousness, and it's linked to anxiety, depression, and a persistent sense of inauthenticity. Meanwhile, people who don't post are living in a different reality. They're not asking, will this get likes? They're asking, do I actually enjoy this? They're not thinking, how will this look to others? They're thinking, how does this feel to me? And that shift from external validation to internal experience changes everything. It's not that they're disconnected. Many have rich social lives, deep friendships, meaningful relationships, but those connections happen directly, in conversations, in presence, in shared experience. Not through carefully constructed digital representations of connection. And there's something more honest about that, more vulnerable, more real, because when you show up in person, you can't edit yourself in real time. You can't delete the awkward parts. You can't curate your imperfections away. You're just there, in all your messy, unfiltered, unoptimized humanity. And paradoxically, that's where real connection happens. Not in the perfectly lit, perfectly captioned version of you, but in the version that shows up, unannounced and unedited, and trusts that's enough. That's what people who don't post have preserved. Not isolation, but genuine, unperformed presence. So what's the deeper truth here? It's this. Happiness isn't found in documentation. It's found in attention. The people who don't post have learned, consciously or not, that life happens in the unrecorded moments, in the experiences too subtle, too private, too ordinary to share, in the conversations that meander without destination, in the quiet hours that produce nothing content-worthy, but everything soul-worthy. They've understood that not everything needs to be witnessed, that some joys are meant to be felt, not displayed, that your life doesn't require external validation to be real, meaningful, or valuable. This is increasingly radical in our current moment, because we're being told constantly that if something isn't shared, it doesn't count, that experiences without proof are somehow less legitimate, that a life lived privately is a life wasted. But the people who resist this narrative carry something precious, sovereignty over their own experience. They own their memories completely, undiluted by how others responded to them. They own their joy, uncontaminated by the need for validation. They own their attention, undivided between living and documenting. And in that ownership lies a particular kind of freedom, the freedom to be ordinary, to be unimpressive, to have experiences that wouldn't interest anyone but you, to live for the sake of living, not for the sake of proving you lived. This isn't about rejecting technology or social connection. It's about reclaiming something fundamental, your right to have a private inner life, to exist beyond the audience's gaze, to be fully yourself, unobserved and unperformed. That's the secret. Not that people who don't post are happier because they're disconnected, but because they're more connected to the one thing that matters most, themselves. If something in this resonated with you, you're not alone. These questions about authenticity, presence, what it means to truly live, they're questions worth sitting with, and they're questions we keep exploring here. The psychology of how we show up in the world, why we do what we do, how to build a life that feels genuinely ours. If that speaks to you, subscribe, because understanding the forces shaping our choices, that's how we become more intentional about the lives we actually want to live. Thank you for being here.